This is George Graybill again, continuing my story of my memoir of my trip around the world in 1970 and 1971. This is chapter 19, Moonlight on the Ganges. Goa is straight up the west coast from Kerala. So I got on the northbound Malabar Express. I think this was my favorite train in India. It came roaring into Pioneer, belching smoke and steam with its trademark large silver star emblazoned on the front of the engine. I climbed aboard, got a window seat on the west side, and watched as the coconut palms and still lagoons glided by. Unfortunately, in those days, the track stopped at Mangalore on the north end of the state. Between there and Goa, there were rivers and wide estuaries that had not yet been bridged. To continue north, I had to string together a series of buses, ferries, and taxis. I later found there were better ways to reach destinations to the north. The taxis were the worst. As many as 7 hot, sweaty men would be crammed into cars that were built to carry 4. The buses were a bit better, but also hot and overcrowded. On one bus ride, the driver stopped at a bridge and told everyone to get out. In his opinion, the bridge was not strong enough to support both the bus and the passengers, so the bus crossed, and then the passengers followed on foot. I'm inserting another picture here because I mentioned Malabar Express, which of course is a steam train. And several chapters ago, I mentioned a steam roller and forgot to put the picture in. So here is the picture of that. Sorry for the digression, but I finally arrived in Panjim, the capital of the state of Goa. I should make some historical notes at this point. Goa was a Portuguese colony until 1961 and had been one for hundreds of years. Goa was even a colony as far back as the Inquisition. Like Spain, Portugal had its own Inquisition at home and in all of its colonies. As a result, the native Hindus in the colony were given an offer they couldn't refuse. So now almost everyone in Goa is Catholic and eats meat. I'm not sure why, but the standard of living in Goa seemed higher than in any of the other Indian states. Panjim was a nice, clean town, and I never saw any slums. They made great bread of a kind I never found anywhere else. Baga Beach was on the other side of a long inlet and had to be accessed by ferry. The town had a touristy feel. The beautiful beach seemed to draw all sorts of vacationers, not just traveling hippies. I'd been told to try to find 2 people when I got there, Father Pyres and 8-Finger Eddie. I told you I'm not making any of this up. They supposedly both liked to help travelers. I asked at the Catholic Church and was told that Benares was out of town. I then asked around for Eddie and learned that he had gone to Nepal. I went for a swim at the beach where the waves were perfect for body surfing. I didn't much like the scene at the beach or the town, though. It was like spring break in Florida. Too many people were trying too hard to have fun. I heard that there was a more laid-back atmosphere in a village a few miles up the coast to the north. It was too late to go there and still find accommodation that night, so I had a meal in a smaller restaurant and asked the owner where I could spend the night. He said there was no place close, but if I liked, I could sleep on his front porch. I thanked him and went outside. I turned out to the so-called porch. It turned out the so-called porch was just a slab of concrete. but I rolled out my bag. I really, I was really just sleeping on the sidewalk. Today, when people give me down and out stories, I always say, that's nothing. I slept on the street in India. That night, I was woken several times by pigs snuffling at my face. Goa is the only place in the country I saw pigs. Most Hindus don't eat meat of any kind, and Muslims don't eat pork. Christians eat anything. The village up the coast was what I was looking for. Small, well-built houses under coconut palms and a quiet, nearly empty beach. I met a young Englishman who told me of a local man who had a room to rent. The room had whitewashed walls, a Madonna statue on a niche, candles for light, and a cow shit floor, which is it's not as nasty as it sounds. And the price was right. I wandered around the village, met a few Western travelers, and was invited to a Christmas party. I found a little restaurant and a little bar a few minutes from the room. I walked up and down the beach. A palm tree bent low over the water had one Christmas tree ornament hanging on it. One day I was walking on the beach. One day as I was walking on the beach, I ran into Daisy from Penang, remember? She looked worse. She said JJ had split and gone to Nepal, and she had just spent her last rupee on a Cadbury chocolate bar. I like to think she was beyond my ability to help her. You've noticed by now that I keep meeting the same people in widely separated spots. That was the thing about the so-called hippie trail. It was both a subculture and a small town spread thinly over 3 continents. The inhabitants tended to congregate at the same location because people gave each other tips on the best routes, accommodations, and places to hang out. There will be many more such chance meetings. I can count on one hand the number of times I've been to a Catholic mass, but I went to the Christmas Eve mass at the local church. The church was small and picturesque because it was of the surrounding palms. I don't remember the service because I couldn't understand what they were saying. I do remember that the men and women sat on separate sides of the center aisle. On Christmas Day, I went for a long walk farther up the beach to the north. I saw another ancient Portuguese fort, like I had seen near the Garukula. This one was more accessible, so I spent some time exploring it. I had wandered miles away from my room and got lost on the way back. I asked directions from a teenage boy. He excitedly invited me into his home to meet his family. We had tea and a special kind of cookie that they said they eat only on Christmas Day. The boy led me all the way back to my village. The party that evening was lively. There was pot and beer and interesting food. There was one bowl of pink citrus fruit sections that the guests thanked the host for. The fruit was very good, but that wasn't the point. The variety of the citrus is so difficult to deal with that it has no commercial value. The fruit looks like a bright green, undersized football. The leathery rind is very difficult to remove, and the sections must be pried apart. Each section is encased in a tough, unchewable sac. Extracting the edible part inside requires a sharp knife and a lot of patience. The young Englishman and I had been going into a long abandoned house to pee at night. When he saw me the next day, he said, "Don't pee in the old house anymore. There's a cobra living in there." I thanked him and suggested we have a beer. At the little bar, we sat outside and split a quart. He spoke about We spoke about our backgrounds, and it turned out he had been born here and was the son of what were called old India hands. In colonial days, a fair number of Englishmen came here on official business, fell in love with the place, and never left. You can find them and their offspring scattered about. We talked of our future, and I said mine was unsettled, but I was considering getting back together with my ex-wife. He said he was in love with a young Indian man. He talked for some time about how wonderful his partner was. I went to Panjim to buy Christmas presents for my relatives in Pennsylvania. Getting there and back took a while. I walked a few miles to the small stream that separated the village from Baga Beach. The tide was in, so I had to swim across the mouth of the stream. I walked more miles to the ferry and finally arrived in Panjim. I remember buying a calendar with garish pictures of the Hindu pantheon for someone. I guess I sent it because I was still at odds with my relatives' evangelical Christianity. I was eating in the little restaurant one day when I suddenly felt dizzy and ran to the outhouse outside. I emptied my body explosively from both ends and stumbled back to my room. My first Indian disease was the scariest one. As I lay there on the cowshit floor shaking with fever, I realized that no one in the world outside this village knew where I was. In a few days I felt better and was 10 pounds lighter. I went to Panjim and bought a train ticket to Bombay. I just passed through Bombay in a few days because I didn't usually enjoy time spent in the large cities. I saw the Gateway of India Arch. Don't go out of your way to see it. One of my favorite Indian surprises happened on a busy street in Bombay. I was in a taxi, I think, following behind a man pedaling a trishaw with a large box on the back between the rear wheels. He stopped at the foot of a steep hill. A door on the back of the box opened, and 6 little girls in matching school uniforms climbed out and pushed their school bus up the hill. It was New Year's Eve. I met some other travelers and we decided to attempt to celebrate. We started with a meal at a very upscale restaurant. The only one I did that while I was traveling. The only time I did that while I was traveling. The food was excellent, and we each had our own waiter dressed in an elaborate costume that included a gold sash and a bejeweled turban. Our waiters hovered around us throughout the meal. It cost $1. I forget what else we did. We eventually toasted the new year and then dropped acid. The next day I went to the palatial Victoria station and bought a ticket to Varanasi. I shared the train compartment with an Indian businessman and a salmon-robed sadhu. We hit it off at once and began sharing mild drugs. I had the least interesting thing to offer, a pack of beedies. Beedies are tiny, cheap hand-rolled cigarettes which are made of a little tobacco rolled in a leaf and tied with a tiny bit of string. People sit on the street making them. It looks like a magic trick. They pick up a leaf, pinch of tobacco, and a bit of string, flip their hands, and a beady pops out. A raised little finger is a universal gesture that means, got a beady? The businessman had pawn or betel nut. I'm not really sure, but I think they are the same thing. Pawn just has a lot of expensive leaves and colorful additives that make it easier to chew. Poor people just chew the betel nut. Poor people that just chew the betel nut look awful. As they chew, the nut causes them to produce gobs of bright red saliva, which stains their mouth, teeth, and the pavement where they spit it out. The sadhu had a chillum, which he stuffed with ganja, that is marijuana. A chillum is a clay tube with a large end where you stuff the ganja, and a small end you clasp in both hands. If you position your hand just right, you can draw smoke down through the tube and into your mouth through an opening in your fingers. The manual dexterity needed to operate a chillum is about equal to that needed to operate chopsticks. Before we knew it, we were pulling into Varanasi station. Varanasi is also called Benares. When we say the two words, they sound different, but the way the Indians say the name of the city, it somehow sounds like it could be either spelling. I wanted most of all to see the ghats. These are wide, long sets of steps leading down to the Ganges River. Pilgrims walk down the steps and wade out into the holy river to bathe. I went to the most famous of several ghats in the city and walked down to the water. On the way, I passed sadhus sitting cross-legged in meditation, a snake charmer, and women in brightly colored saris. It was exciting. I was dying to wade into the water with all the Indians, but I just couldn't. The water was completely opaque and about the color of a latte. It would probably be toxic to an unbeliever. I was backing up and away from the water when I heard someone say, "You're American, right?" "I am. You sound like you are too." A man in his 20s introduced himself. We exchanged stories of how we got to where we were. He had been fighting in Vietnam and had been discharged from the army. Although he had fought and I hadn't, our feelings about the war weren't very different. "Listen," he said, "see that little booth up there? They have these amazing banana Bhang Lassies." He was referring to a drink that was something like a smoothie that included powdered marijuana. "Sure, I'd like to try one." The booth was open air with a good view of the ghats and the river. The lassi was delicious. We were sipping and talking. The vet talked about the current situation in the war. He said that decision making had been moving down to lower and lower ranking officers while pot smoking had been moving up through the ranks. Now, pot smoking and decision making had met, and America was losing the war because the people making the decisions were stoned most of the time. He said he had been in charge of 1,000 men and that they spent all their time trying to avoid the Viet Cong. This may have all been BS because I never heard anything like this from other vets. At the time, though, he sounded believable and trustworthy. I was getting a nice high and craving for something good to eat or drink, like another lassi. "This is great. Should we have another one?" "Okay with me, but I should warn you that we haven't felt the full effect of the first one yet." By the time we finished the second lassi, we were still on the way up. I said, if we're going to move to somewhere else, we should probably do it while we still can. "We can go to my place. I'm staying on a little boat that I'm renting from a local river tour guide. See those boats out on the river? They take tourists up and down the river. It's one of those." The boats he pointed to were fairly large with a little cabin, but they were all powered by oars. There were no motorboats in sight. We got up and I followed the vet. I could walk well enough, but I was floating through a dreamscape. We entered a narrow walkway lined with vendors. The colors of the merchandise in the shops were dazzling. A great variety of pawn ingredients were on display in one shop. All sorts of candy were spread out in the next, but the fabric shops were the best. We continued on through a maze of narrow passageways. The way streets are arranged in this part of Varanasi, there are only a few wide streets forming blocks that are maybe a mile on a side. Inside the block, it is like an anthill where no vehicles can enter. Mixed together are dwellings, merchandise shops, workshops, markets, food vendors, and temples. As we penetrated deeper, we passed some sort of temple where priests were performing a ritual involving flower petals, honey, candles, and a large black bull. We were descending a narrow stairway towards the river when we heard rapid footsteps behind us. We stepped into a doorway to let 4 men pass. They were running and carrying what looked like a body wrapped in colored cloth. Pallbearers, the vet said. When we arrived at the boat, we could see the flames at the pyres up and down the river. Wood is scarce and expensive, he said. Some people can't afford quite enough, so a few bones end up in the river. Another reason not to do the bathing in the Ganges, right, I thought. We walked across a plank and stepped down into the cabin of the boat. The interior was dark, plain, but comfortable. The front room had mats to sit on around a small hibachi. The small back room had a single bed. It was dark now, and we could see the lights on the river up and down the shore. The vet made tea on the hibachi and we talked. When the Lassies wore off, we smoked some hash. At some point, I think it was me who said, you know, we could just untie the boat and drift down the Ganges. It would be an interesting trip. It would. We could sell the boat at the mouth of the river and come back and pay the owner for it. We were actually considering it when I remembered something. No, wait. There's a war in East Pakistan where we would end up, and neither of us wants to be in a war zone. I had almost made a terrible mistake. This was the beginning of the war that resulted in the creation of the independent state of Bangladesh. I had heard that Pakistanis were chasing all the Hindus out of East Pakistan and refugees were piling up in Calcutta. It sounded bad, so I had already donated my tent to them. It was approaching dawn when we ran out of conversation. I teetered across the plank and into the city and immediately realized I had no idea how to get back to my room. I started winding my way uphill. It was also interesting that I didn't much mind being lost. From time to time, I stopped to watch activities in the workshops and temples. I allowed a cow to pass and watched monkeys climbing around up above. For a long time, I watched a man weaving bright green and gold cloth into an enormous loom. Both hands and feet of the man were in constant motion. After about an hour, I emerged into a broad street that I recognized. It was just getting light. The street was empty except for a woman walking towards me. She had a large metal urn balanced on her head. I gave her money for a cup of tea. She filled a cup from the spigot on the urn without being able to see what she was doing. I drank the tea and returned the cup. I spent the next day sightseeing, including a boat ride on the Ganges and a boat like the vet's. In the evening, I went to the station to buy a train ticket to the Indian town on the Nepalese border. Vagrant thoughts. I'm concerned that I'm giving the impression that I led a life of nonstop substance abuse. It seems that all the events I describe involve getting altered in some way. It is more the case that the most interesting times, for some reason, just coincide with being high. Those scenes were separated by long, boring stretches of being straight and sober.